What if your life changed forever in a single moment? A stormy night, a reclusive billionaire haunted by his past, and a desperate girl seeking refuge. When Elias Moretti opens his doors to a teenager named Mia, he has no idea that she carries a truth that will shatter everything he thought he knew about his family. But Mia isn't just running from her past. She's being hunted by dangerous men who will stop at nothing to uncover the secrets her mother left behind. As their lives intertwine, a journey of redemption, trust, and survival begins. Can Elias protect the granddaughter he never knew he had, or will the shadows of his past consume them both? This is a story of love, sacrifice, and the power of family bonds, forged in the face of danger. Stay with us for a story that will grip your heart, challenge your emotions, and leave you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss this. The rain lashed against the enormous windows of the Moretti mansion, turning the view of the surrounding forest into a blurred painting of greens and grays. Inside, the air was heavy with stillness. Elias Moretti sat at the head of a dining table meant to accommodate a dozen guests, though none had graced its surface in over a decade. A plate of untouched food sat before him, flanked by silver utensils perfectly aligned with the edges of the fine china. The mansion was a fortress of solitude, each corridor echoing with memories Elias wished to forget. The ornate chandelier above him cast a golden glow over the room, but it only accentuated the emptiness. His life had become a meticulous routine, a way to keep chaos at bay. Chaos reminded him of what he'd lost. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass with the precision of a man who controlled every aspect of his life. The smell of oak and aged grapes filled the air, but the flavor was lost on him. His mind, as it often did, drifted to that night. The crash, the ambulance sirens, the hospital hallways where the doctor had confirmed his worst fears. His wife and daughter were gone. A sharp clatter broke through the silence. Elias's eyes snapped to the source, a vase near the far corner of the room, tilted precariously on its pedestal. The sound of a rustling breeze followed, faint but distinct. His brow furrowed. The East Wing. No one had been there for years. His home staff, though loyal, rarely ventured into that part of the mansion. He had locked the doors to those memories long ago, along with the rooms themselves. The East Wing was a mausoleum of the life he had once lived. Another noise, a muffled thud. It was faint, but enough to jolt him from his seat. He grabbed the flashlight resting by the fireplace and moved through the dimly lit halls, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The air grew colder as he neared the East Wing. Dust coated the surfaces of antique furniture, and the walls were lined with portraits of Moretti ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow him as he passed. He reached the double doors that led to the wing's main hall. They creaked open reluctantly, revealing a cavernous space veiled in darkness. "Who's there?" Elias called, his deep voice carrying through the empty hall. No response. He stepped inside, his flashlight casting long shadows against the draped furniture and peeling wallpaper. The smell of mildew and abandonment hung heavy in the air. As he approached the far end of the hall, a faint scuffling noise reached his ears. He turned sharply, aiming the flashlight toward the source. Behind an old sofa, something shifted. A figure. He moved closer, his heart pounding. "Show yourself," he demanded. Slowly, a girl emerged from the shadows. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her thin frame, and her hair was plastered to her pale face. Her wide eyes reflected the beam of the flashlight like a startled animal. Clutched tightly to her chest was a tattered backpack. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain pounding against the roof. "Don't call the police." Elias stared at her, his sharp mind struggling to piece together the sight before him. A trespasser in his home. A child, no older than 16, trembling like a leaf. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice cold and measured. The girl hesitated, her gaze darting toward the door as though calculating her chances of escape. "I'm Mia," she said finally, her voice quivering. I didn't mean to. I needed somewhere to stay. Her words hung in the air, fragile and desperate. Elias tightened his grip on the flashlight, his instincts torn between anger at the intrusion and an unshakable curiosity about how she had ended up here. "You're trespassing," he said flatly. "You don't belong here." "I know," she said quickly. "I'll leave in the morning. Just, please, let me stay tonight." Elias studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes taking in her gaunt frame and trembling hands. Against his better judgment, he stepped aside and motioned toward the doorway. "Follow me." Mia hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, clutching her backpack tightly, as if it were a shield. She followed Elias through the dimly lit corridors, her wet sneakers squeaking against the polished floors. The warmth of the main wing enveloped her as they entered, a stark contrast to the damp chill of the east wing. Elias led her to the living room, its grand fireplace roaring with life. The room was decorated in muted tones of beige and gold, exuding understated elegance. He motioned toward the armchair nearest the fire. "Sit," he commanded. Mia hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the plush chair. Reluctantly, she lowered herself into it, sinking into the soft cushions. Elias moved to a bar cart in the corner, pouring a glass of water. He handed it to her without a word. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Elias settled into the chair opposite her, studying her with the intensity of a man used to uncovering motives. She looked out of place against the opulence of the room, her clothes tattered, her face pale, and her posture defensive. "Explain yourself," he said finally. "Why are you here?" "I didn't have anywhere else to go," Mia said, her voice trembling. "It was raining, and I saw the lights. I thought this place was empty." Elias frowned. "And what made you think you had the right to intrude?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I needed shelter." He leaned back, his fingers steepled as he regarded her. "You're alone." She nodded. "I've been alone for a long time." Elias's sharp gaze softened slightly. Something about her vulnerability reminded him of his daughter. He pushed the thought aside. "What's in the bag?" Mia's grip on the backpack tightened. "Just my things," she said quickly. "Show me." She hesitated, then unzipped the bag with trembling hands. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, a toothbrush, and a crumpled photograph. Elias's breath caught as his eyes fell on the image, a young woman holding a baby. "Where did you get this?" he asked sharply. Mia's face went pale. "It's mine," she said. "She's my mother." Elias's mind reeled. The woman in the photograph was unmistakably his daughter. A surge of emotion welled up within him. Disbelief, hope, and fear intertwining in a dizzying spiral. "You're lying," he said, his voice cold. "I'm not," Mia insisted. "She told me about you. She said you'd never want to see me. But enough." Elias rose abruptly, his chest tight. "You'll stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll discuss this further." Mia nodded, her relief evident despite the tension in her shoulders. "Thank you." As Elias left the room, the photograph burned in his mind. Could it be possible? Could this girl be the granddaughter he never knew he had? The question swirled in his mind, and for the first time in years, the silence of the mansion felt oppressive. The morning light crept through the towering windows of the Moretti mansion, casting long, slanted shadows across the floor. Elias stood in the vast kitchen, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall. His mind, however, was anything but quiet. The photograph was still in his study, lying on the mahogany desk where he had left it the previous night. The image of his daughter, older than he remembered her, holding a baby, haunted him. How could this be? His daughter had died in the accident. He had grieved her loss for years, drowning in guilt and regret. Yet here was a girl claiming to be her child, and the resemblance was impossible to ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps. He turned to see Mia standing hesitantly in the doorway, clutching her backpack as if it were her lifeline. She looked out of place in the gleaming, modern kitchen, her small frame dwarfed by the high ceilings and sleek appliances. Her clothes were still damp from the night before, her hair unkempt and falling into her eyes. "You're awake," Elias said, his voice cool and measured. Mia nodded, shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. "I didn't mean sleep so long," she said quietly. "I can leave if you want." Elias regarded her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching her face. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the breakfast bar. "We need to talk." Mia hesitated, then slid onto one of the stools, her hands resting on the countertop. Elias placed a plate of toast and a glass of orange juice in front of her. She stared at it for a moment before taking a tentative bite, her movements cautious. "What's your full name?" Elias asked, breaking the silence. "Mia," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mia Hart." "And your mother's name?" His tone was steady, but there was an edge of tension beneath the surface. "Amelia," Mia replied, glancing up at him. "Amelia Moretti. She told me about you. Said you were her father." Elias's chest tightened at the sound of his daughter's name. He had spent years trying to bury the memories of her, yet now they surged to the surface with painful clarity. "Your mother died," he said, his voice low, "in a car accident. Years ago." Mia shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "She didn't," she said, her voice trembling. "She survived. She told me about it, but she didn't want you to know. She said it was better that way." Elias's grip on the edge of the counter tightened. "Why would she say that?" he demanded. "Why would she keep this from me?" Mia looked down at her hands, her shoulders hunched. "She said you wouldn't want us," she whispered. "She said you blamed yourself for what happened, and that you wouldn't want to be reminded." The words hit Elias like a blow. The idea that his daughter had been alive, raising a child in secret, was almost too much to process. His guilt and regret, already heavy, now threatened to crush him entirely. "You have proof of this?" he asked finally, his voice sharp. Mia reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn envelope. She slid it across the counter toward Elias, her hands trembling. He opened it carefully, his breath catching as he pulled out several faded photographs and a letter. The letter was in Amelia's handwriting, unmistakably hers. The words blurred as Elias read them, his vision clouded by emotion. "I'm sorry, Dad," the letter began. "I didn't know how to face you after everything. I thought it would be easier if I stayed away." Elias's hands shook as he set the letter down. The weight of Amelia's words was overwhelming. He looked up at Mia, who was watching it with a mixture of fear and hope. "You should have told me this last night," he said, his voice strained. "I was scared," Mia admitted. "I didn't know if you'd believe me." Elias sighed heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "We'll talk more about this later," he said. "For now, eat." Mia nodded, taking another bite of toast. Elias watched her in silence, his mind racing. If what she said was true, then everything he thought he knew about his daughter's death was a lie. And if Mia was truly his granddaughter, then she was all he had left of Amelia. After breakfast, Elias led Mia into his study, a cavernous room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. The photograph and letter lay where he had left them, and he gestured for Mia to sit in the leather armchair across from him. "We need to establish some ground rules," Elias said, his tone firm. "If you're going to stay here, you'll need to follow my rules." Mia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clutching her backpack. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. I didn't know where else to go." Elias studied her for a long moment, his sharp gaze piercing. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Why are you here?" Mia hesitated, then looked down at her hands. "I ran away," she admitted, "from my foster home. It wasn't safe there." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" Mia's voice trembled as she explained. "My foster father. He wasn't a good man. He hurt people, hurt me. I couldn't stay there anymore. Elias's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest. The thought of anyone harming a child, his granddaughter, was enough to make his blood boil. "Does he know you're here?" he asked. Mia shook her head. "I don't think so. I didn't tell anyone where I was going." Elias leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He didn't want to get involved in someone else's mess, but Mia's story was too personal to ignore. If she was truly his granddaughter, then he had a responsibility to protect her. "You can stay," he said finally, his voice firm. "But only until we figure out what to do next." Mia's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't thank me yet," Elias replied. "This isn't permanent. And if your foster father comes looking for you, I'll need to know everything." Mia nodded quickly. "I understand." Elias stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "I'll have one of the guest rooms prepared for you," he said. "You'll find fresh clothes and anything else you need there." "Okay," Mia said, standing as well. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "Thank you for believing me." Elias didn't respond. As Mia left the room, he sat back down at his desk, staring at the photograph and letter. The house, once a sanctuary of silence, now felt alive with possibilities and danger. For the first time in years, Elias felt the stirrings of purpose. But with it came a gnawing sense of unease. If Mia's foster father was as dangerous as she claimed, then Elias's secluded life was about to become much more complicated. The guest room Elias had prepared for Mia was one of the smallest in the mansion, but to her, it felt like a palace. The thick comforter on the bed, the soft rug beneath her feet, and the warmth of the room were luxuries she hadn't experienced in years. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery of the bedspread. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe, or as close to safe as she could feel in a stranger's home. But her safety wasn't guaranteed. Elias had made it clear that her stay was temporary, and the weight of her secrets pressed heavily on her chest. She glanced at her backpack on the floor, the photograph and letter still inside. They had been enough to convince Elias to let her stay, but she knew he wasn't entirely convinced of her story. She wasn't sure he ever would be. Downstairs, Elias paced the length of his study. The photograph and letter were spread out on the desk before him, alongside other items he had unearthed from a dusty box in the East Wing. Old family photos, a few letters from Amelia, and even a small bracelet that had once belonged to his daughter. He hadn't touched these items in years, but now they felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. He stopped in front of the fireplace, staring into the flames as if they held the answers he sought. Amelia's letter had shaken him to his core. How had he missed the signs? How had he allowed his grief to blind him to the possibility that his daughter had survived? And if Mia was telling the truth, what had driven Amelia to keep her away? The answers, he suspected, lay somewhere in the mansion. The East Wing had been Amelia's domain before the accident, a space she had filled with her art, her laughter, and her warmth. After her death, Elias had locked it away, unable to face the memories. But now he had no choice. Elias retrieved a set of keys from his desk drawer and made his way to the East Wing. The double doors groaned as he pushed them open, and a wave of musty air greeted him. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight streaming through the cracked shutters. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the space an eerie, ghostly appearance. He moved through the rooms methodically, his flashlight cutting through the dimness. He opened drawers, sifted through papers, and examined every object he came across. Most of it was unremarkable: old receipts, sketches Amelia had abandoned, and trinkets that held no significance. But in the last room, tucked away in a corner beneath a pile of forgotten canvases, he found something that made his breath catch. It was a journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with Amelia's handwriting. Elias's hands trembled as he opened it, scanning the first few entries. The early pages were filled with mundane details, lists of supplies for her art, notes about her favorite books, and musings about the weather. But as he flipped further, the tone changed. "I can't tell him." One entry read, "It would destroy him. But how long can I keep this secret? How long can I keep running?" Elias's heart pounded as he read the words. The entries grew darker, filled with fear and desperation. Amelia had been hiding something, something she believed would shatter him. He flipped to the final page, but it was blank, as if she had stopped writing before she could finish her thoughts. He closed the journal, his mind reeling. Whatever Amelia had been running from, it was connected to Mia. And if Elias wanted answers, he would have to confront the past he had tried so hard to bury. Elias wasn't the only one grappling with the weight of the past. Upstairs, Mia sat by the window of her room, staring out at the sprawling estate. The rain had stopped, leaving the grounds glistening in the afternoon sun. She watched as the gardener tended to the hedges, his movements calm and methodical. It was a scene of peace and order, a stark contrast to the chaos she had fled from. Her thoughts drifted to her foster father. She had left him behind, but she knew he wouldn't let her go so easily. He wasn't the type to give up on something or someone he considered his possession. The memory of his anger sent a shiver down her spine. She had been careful not to leave a trail, but a small part of her wondered if she had been careful enough. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, she turned to see Elias standing in the doorway, holding the journal. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that made her stomach twist. "We need to talk," he said, his voice clipped. Mia nodded, following him down to the study. She sat in the same leather chair as before, her hands folded in her lap. Elias placed the journal on the desk between them, his gaze piercing. "I found this in the East Wing," he said. "It belonged to your mother." Mia's eyes widened. You went in there?" "I had to," Elias said. "I needed answers." Mia hesitated, her gaze flicking to the journal. What did it say? Elias's expression softened slightly. She was hiding something, something that frightened her. "Do you know what it was?" Mia shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "She never told me. She always seemed scared, like she was running from something." Elias leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Whatever Amelia had been running from, it had followed her, and now it was threatening Mia. The thought made his chest tighten with anger and fear. He had failed Amelia, but he wouldn't fail Mia. Not if he could help it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car engine. He rose from his seat, moving to the window. A black SUV was parked at the edge of the driveway, its tinted windows reflecting the sunlight. Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't recognize the vehicle, and uninvited guests were a rarity on his estate. "Stay here," he said, his tone firm. Mia's eyes widened. "What is it?" "Probably nothing," Elias said, though his gut told him otherwise. He left the study, making his way to the front door. The SUV's engine idled as he approached, and the driver's side window rolled down. A man with a scarred face and cold eyes peered out. "Can I help you?" Elias asked, his voice sharp. The man smirked. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A girl, about 16, goes by Mia." Elias's blood ran cold. "I don't know anyone by that name," he lied, his expression unreadable. The man's smirk widened. "Well, if you see her, let me know," he said, handing Elias a business card. "She's got something that doesn't belong to her." The SUV drove off, leaving Elias standing in the driveway. His hands clenched into fists. The danger Mia had warned him about was closer than he had realized, and it was only a matter of time before it reached them. Mia sat cross-legged on the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on the journal Elias had given her. She hadn't opened it yet. The weight of it in her lap felt suffocating, as though it held not just her mother's secrets, but also the answers she wasn't ready to face. Her fingers traced the cracked leather cover, worn with time and memories she hadn't been a part of. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting warm light across the room. For a fleeting moment, she let herself imagine that this mansion, with its grandeur and warmth, could be home. But the sharp memory of the scarred man's face from Elias's description shattered the illusion. He was out there looking for her, and she had no illusions about what would happen if he found her. A knock on the door startled her from her thoughts. She quickly slipped the journal under her pillow and looked up as Elias entered. He held a tray with a bowl of steaming soup, a small sandwich, and a glass of water. For someone who'd spent the past decade immersed in solitude, he carried it with surprising care. "You need to eat," he said simply, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Thanks," Mia murmured, her voice barely audible. Elias remained by the door, his arms crossed. He looked at her not with pity, but with the sharp scrutiny of someone used to analyzing every detail. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke. "That journal belonged to your mother," he said. "It might have answers to why she kept you a secret." Mia's gaze dropped to her hands. "I don't know if I want to know," she admitted. Elias frowned, stepping closer. "Not knowing won't change what happened," he said, his tone firmer now. "But it might help us understand how to protect you. Protect her." The words carried a weight she hadn't felt in years. It had been so long since anyone had cared enough to even try. She nodded slowly, her fingers inching toward the pillow where the journal was hidden. "I'll read it," she said softly. "But not right now." Elias didn't press her. Instead, he turned to the window, his gaze distant. "You remind me of her," he said after a moment. "Your mother." She had the same stubbornness. Mia blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in his tone. "What was she like?" she asked hesitantly. Elias hesitated, as if the memories were painful to revisit. "She was vibrant," he said finally. "She had this way of lighting up a room, of making you feel like you were the only person who mattered. She loved painting, reading, and challenging every rule I tried to set." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "She was my world," he said, his voice quieter now. "And when I lost her, I thought I'd lost everything." Mia swallowed hard, her heart aching for this man who had built a fortress around himself to keep the world out. "You didn't lose everything," she said, her voice trembling. "You still have me." Elias turned to her, his sharp gaze softening. For the first time, he saw not just a frightened girl, but a connection to the daughter he had loved and lost. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I do." That night, Elias sat in his study, the journal open before him. He had hoped Mia would read it, but his own need for answers had driven him to it first. Each entry painted a picture of Amelia's life after the accident, a life of fear, secrecy, and sacrifice. One entry stood out. "I thought I could stay ahead of him, but he always finds us. I don't know how much longer I can keep Mia safe. If anything happens to me, I hope she finds her way to Dad. Maybe he can give her what I couldn't." Elias's jaw tightened. Him. The word hung in his mind, heavy with implication. Whoever this man was, he had driven Amelia into hiding and was now hunting Mia. Elias's protective instincts surged to the surface. He would not fail his granddaughter the way he had failed his daughter. The next morning, the estate felt different. Elias's staff had been instructed to increase security, and he had personally called in a private investigator to gather information on Mia's foster father. He wasn't taking any chances. Mia, meanwhile, had ventured into the mansion's expansive library. Rows upon rows of books lined the walls, their spines gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She trailed her fingers along the shelves, marveling at the collection. Her mother had loved books, and she couldn't help but wonder if these had once been Amelia's sanctuary. She pulled a worn novel from the shelf, its pages yellowed with age. As she flipped through it, a piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, her eyes widening as she read the handwritten note. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. But it also means you're stronger than I ever was. Keep going. Love, Mom." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the note to her chest. Her mother had left pieces of herself everywhere, like breadcrumbs leading her home. But even as Mia felt a flicker of hope, The shadow of danger loomed large. Elias entered the library, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mia followed him to the study, where he handed her a report. "My investigator found something," he said. "Your foster father, his name is Arthur Greaves. He has a criminal record, including charges for assault and fraud." Mia's hands trembled as she scanned the report. "He'll never stop looking for me," she whispered. "He won't find you," Elias said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." But even as he said the words, a nagging doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. The scarred man's visit, Amelia's warnings in her journal, they all pointed to a storm brewing on the horizon. And Elias knew that when it came, he would have to face it head-on. The sound of the heavy rain returned, pounding against the grand windows of the Moretti mansion. Elias stood in the foyer, his posture rigid, staring at the business card left by the scarred man in the black SUV. He twirled it between his fingers, a part of him debating whether to destroy it or keep it as a warning of the danger looming over them. Behind him, Mia appeared at the base of the sweeping staircase, clutching a book she had taken from the library. She hesitated, sensing the tension radiating from Elias. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Elias turned sharply, tucking the card into his pocket. "We need to talk," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "Come into the study." Mia followed him, her heart pounding as she tried to decipher his tone. She could feel the unease in the air, thick and heavy like the storm outside. Once they were seated in the study, Elias leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "The man who came here yesterday," he began, his gaze locked on hers. "He's not just looking for you. He's tied to your mother's past." Mia blinked, the words sinking in slowly. "My mom," she whispered. "But how?" Elias stood, pacing to fireplace. His fingers traced the edges of the mantel as if grounding himself. "Your mother left behind more than just you," he said. "She left behind secrets. Secrets she didn't want me to know." He turned to face Mia, his expression unreadable. "I've been in contact with someone who might have answers." "Who?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Who would know about my mom?" Elias hesitated, then crossed the room to a side table where an old rotary phone sat. He picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. "Henry," he said when the line connected. "I need to see you. Now." 2 hours later, a car pulled into the driveway. Mia watched from the window as a man in his late 50s stepped out, adjusting his raincoat against the drizzle. His graying hair was neatly combed, and his polished shoes gleamed even in the wet light. There was something measured about his movements, as if every step was calculated. "That's Henry Stanton," Elias said from behind her. "He was an old friend, and my lawyer." Mia turned to look at him. "Was?" Elias's jaw tightened. "He betrayed me." Minutes later, Henry stood in the study, shaking the rain off his coat. He looked at Elias with a mixture of guilt and hesitation, his eyes darting to Mia before returning to the man he had once called a friend. "It's been a long time, Elias," Henry said, his voice calm but strained. "Not long enough," Elias replied coldly. "I didn't call you here to catch up. I called because I need answers." Henry's gaze flicked to Mia again. "So it's true," he said quietly. "She found you." Elias stepped closer, his tone icy. "You knew about her, didn't you? About Amelia, about Mia. All these years you knew, and you said nothing." Henry sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't tell you because I thought I was protecting you," he said. "Amelia made me promise." "Protecting me?" Elias's voice rose, anger flashing in his eyes. "You let me believe my daughter was dead. You let me live with that guilt. How is that protection?" "I did what she asked," Henry said, his voice firm but laced with regret. "She didn't want you involved. She didn't want Mia caught up in your world." Elias turned away, his hands clenched into fists. He had spent years mourning his daughter, blaming himself for her death, only to find out that the truth had been hidden from him. "And now," he said, his voice quieter, but no less sharp. "Why are you here now?" "Because things have changed," Henry said. "The people Amelia was running from, they're still looking for something. And Mia might be the key." Mia stiffened at the words, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Henry looked at her, his expression softening. "Your mother, she was trying to protect you from them. She thought if she stayed away from Elias, they wouldn't find you. But now that you're here, they'll come for her," Elias finished, his voice grim. "They already have." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation pressing down on all of them. Elias finally turned to Henry, his gaze hard. "You'll tell me everything," he said. "No more secrets. No more lies." Henry nodded, the guilt in his eyes undeniable. "I'll tell you what I know, but you won't like it." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the study's walls. Henry leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as he began to recount the story Elias had been waiting years to hear. "After the accident, Amelia came to me," Henry said. "She was alive, but barely. She was terrified, Elias. She said there were people after her, people who wanted something she had." Elias's jaw tightened. "What people?" Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Investors. Powerful ones. They had ties to your business, Elias. Amelia discovered something illegal. And when she tried to expose it, they came after her." Elias's chest tightened. "Illegal? In my business?" Henry nodded. "You didn't know, but she did. She said she couldn't let you take the fall for it. So she ran. She thought if she disappeared, they'd leave you alone." "And Mia?" Elias asked, his voice quieter now. "Why didn't she tell me about Mia?" Henry looked at Mia, his expression heavy with regret. "She didn't want you to know, because she didn't think you could protect her. She thought the guilt would destroy you." The words hit Elias like a blow, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to Mia, who sat frozen in her chair, her face pale. "Is this true?" he asked her gently. "Did your mother ever talk about this?" Mia shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't tell me much, just that we had to keep moving, that we couldn't trust anyone." Elias sank into his chair, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was far darker than he had imagined. His daughter had lived in fear, running from enemies he hadn't even known existed. And now, that fear had found its way to his doorstep. "What do they want?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Henry hesitated. "They think Mia has something Amelia left behind." "What?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't have anything." Henry shook his head. "You might not know you have it, but they won't stop until they find it." Elias stood, his expression resolute. "Then we won't let them." Mia looked at him, her eyes wide. "How? How can we stop them?" Elias met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "I've spent my life building empires, Mia. And now, I'll use everything I have to protect you." For the first time, Mia felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. But as the storm outside raged on, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The morning air was crisp, the rain having finally subsided to leave behind a misty, gray stillness over the sprawling estate. Elias stood by the window in his study, his eyes scanning the manicured grounds as if expecting trouble at any moment. Henry's revelation from the night before still churned in his mind, and the danger Mia faced felt more tangible than ever. Mia, meanwhile, sat cross-legged on the floor of a library, surrounded by books she had pulled from the shelves. Her mother's journal rested open beside her, its pages filled with Amelia's elegant handwriting. Each word felt like a piece of her mother she was rediscovering, but the deeper she delved, the more questions arose. One entry caught her attention. "If you're reading this, Mia, it means I didn't have the chance to explain. I'm sorry. You'll find what you need in the blue case. Protect it at all costs." Mia frowned, her fingers tracing the words. The blue case. She had no idea what her mother had been referring to. Her mother's belongings had been minimal, often left behind during their hasty moves from one place to another. Could the case still exist? And if so, what was inside it? Her thoughts were interrupted by Elias's voice calling from the hallway. "Mia, I need you in the study." She quickly closed the journal and placed it back in her bag, rising to her feet. When she entered the study, Elias was seated at his desk, a grave expression on his face. Across from him sat Henry, whose usual composure seemed slightly cracked. "What's going on?" Mia asked, her gaze darting between them. Elias gestured for her to sit. "There's been a development," he said carefully. "My investigator found out something new about Arthur Greaves, your foster father." Mia tensed, her fingers curling around the armrests of her chair. "What did he find?" "Greaves has been working with the people who were after your mother," Elias explained. "He's not just some petty criminal. He's part of a larger network." Henry leaned forward, his voice low. "They're looking for the same thing Amelia was protecting. If they think you have it, they won't stop until they get it." Mia felt a wave of fear wash over her. "I don't have anything," she said. "I don't even know what they're looking for." "That may not matter to them," Elias said grimly, "which is why we need to be prepared." Before Mia could respond, a loud noise echoed through the mansion, the sharp clang of the front gate being forced open. Elias and Henry exchanged a tense look before Elias rose to his feet, his expression hard. "Stay here," he instructed Mia. "No." Mia protested, standing as well. "If it's him, if it's Greaves, he's here for me. I can't just hide." Elias turned to her, his gaze stern. "You will stay here," he said firmly. "I've already failed once to protect my family. I won't fail again." Downstairs, the front door creaked open, and Elias stepped into the foyer. The scarred man from the SUV stood in the entryway, flanked by two others. Their casual stances belied the menace in their sharp eyes and the faint smirk playing on the leader's lips. "You're trespassing," Elias said coldly, his hands clenched at his sides. "You have no business here." "Actually, I do," the scarred man said, his tone mocking. "I believe you're harboring someone who belongs to me." Elias's jaw tightened. "No one belongs to you." The man chuckled darkly. "Come on, Mr. Moretti. Let's not play games. Hand over the girl, and we'll be out of your hair." "I don't think so," Elias replied. His voice was calm, but the sharpness in his eyes spoke volumes. "You'll leave now, or I'll have you forcibly removed." The man's smirk widened. "You think your money can protect you? They can protect her. Let me tell you something. Money runs out. And when it does, people like me are still standing." Elias took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "You don't know who you're dealing with." For a moment, the man's smirk faltered. But before he could respond, heavy footsteps echoed from the staircase. Elias turned sharply to see Mia standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale but defiant. "No, Mia," Elias said, his tone sharp. "Go back." Mia ignored him, her gaze locked on the scarred man. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You don't own me." The man tilted his head, studying her. "Brave words, kid," he said, "but bravery won't save you. Neither will threats," Elias interjected, stepping between them. "Get out of my house, now." For a moment, the tension in the room was suffocating. Then, with a shrug, the scarred man turned and signaled for his men to follow. "This isn't over," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "We'll be back." As the door closed behind them, Mia let out a shaky breath, her knees threatening to buckle. Elias was at her side in an instant, steadying her. "I told you to stay upstairs," he said, his voice a mixture of anger and concern. "I couldn't," Mia said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't just hide." Elias sighed, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're not hiding. You're surviving. And I'll make sure you keep surviving." Later that evening, Elias sat alone in his study, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had faced countless threats in his lifetime, competitors' lawsuits, hostile takeovers, but none of them had ever felt as personal or as dangerous as this. On his desk lay a folder containing everything his investigator had gathered on Arthur Greaves and the men working with him. The deeper Elias delved, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary criminal enterprise. These men were organized, ruthless, and well-connected. But one detail stood out: a reference to a storage facility registered under Amelia's name. It was located in a small town 2 hours away, and according to the records, it hadn't been accessed in years. The blue case. Elias's mind raced as he connected the dots. Could this storage unit hold the key to everything Amelia had been hiding? If so, it was imperative that he get there before Greaves and his men did. The first light of dawn illuminated the Moretti mansion as Elias and Mia prepared for their next move. The tension from the scarred man's visit lingered in the air, and Elias knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The discovery of the storage facility registered under Amelia's name had given them a lead, but it also carried risks. If Greaves and his men were as resourceful as Henry claimed, they might already be on their way to the same destination. Mia sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Her eyes, red from a restless night, darted toward Elias, who stood by the window, staring out at the estate grounds. The security team he had hired was already patrolling the perimeter, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the rising sun. "Are you sure about this?" Mia asked, breaking the silence. Elias turned to face her, his expression unwavering. "We don't have a choice," he said. "If that storage facility holds the answers we're looking for, we need to get there before anyone else does." Mia nodded, her fingers tightening around the cup. "What if they're already there?" she asked. "What if we're walking into a trap?" Elias crossed the room, his footsteps deliberate. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll deal with it," he said firmly. "I've spent my life preparing for battles like this. Trust me, Mia. I won't let anything happen to you." Mia looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. Despite her fear, a small part of her began to believe that Elias might actually be able to protect her. By mid-morning, they were on the road. Elias had opted for a nondescript black SUV, trading in his usual luxury vehicles to avoid drawing attention. Henry had insisted on joining them, though Elias remained wary of his motives. The three of them traveled in tense silence, the hum of the engine the only sound as they made their way out of the city and into the countryside. Mia stared out the window, her thoughts racing. The mention of the blue case had triggered a vague memory, her mother hurriedly packing something into a small, locked container before they had fled one of their many temporary homes. Amelia had been so protective of it, refusing to let anyone near it. Could this be the same case? "We're almost there," Elias said, breaking the silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the road ahead. Henry leaned forward from the back seat. "Do we have a plan if Greaves shows up?" Elias's jaw tightened. "We stick to the shadows. If it's safe, we retrieve the case and leave. If not, we wait and observe. The priority is to stay ahead of them." Mia glanced at him, her stomach churning with anxiety. "And if they find us?" Elias's eyes met hers in the rear-view mirror. "They won't." The storage facility was located on the outskirts of a small, quiet town. Rows of identical units stretched out across the lot, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The air was still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic on the nearby highway. Elias parked the SUV a short distance away, out of sight from the main office. The three of them exited the vehicle, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached the gate. Elias handed Mia a pair of gloves and nodded toward the keypad. "No fingerprints," he said. Mia took a deep breath and entered the access code Henry had retrieved from Amelia's records. The gate clicked open with a metallic groan, and they slipped inside. The storage unit was near the back of a lot, its number matching the one in the records. Elias motioned for Mia to stay behind him as he approached the door, his movements careful and deliberate. He inserted the key and turned it slowly, the lock clicking open. The door rolled up with a sharp metallic clatter, revealing a dimly lit space filled with boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the unit sat a small blue case, its surface scratched and worn. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her eyes locked on the case. "This is it," she whispered. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her. "Wait," he said. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes searching for any signs of tampering. When he was satisfied, he nodded. "Go ahead." Mia approached the case, her hands trembling as she reached for the latches. She hesitated, her gaze flicking to Elias. He gave her a small nod of encouragement, and she opened the case. Inside were a stack of documents, a small black notebook, and a USB drive. Mia picked up the notebook, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages. The handwriting was her mother's, each page filled with notes, diagrams, and what looked like financial records. "What is it?" Henry asked, stepping closer. Mia held up the notebook. "It's everything," she said. "Everything my mom was hiding." Elias took the USB drive, his expression grim. "Let's go," he said. "We'll examine this back at the house." The drive back to the mansion was tense. Elias kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of pursuit. The weight of the USB drive in his pocket felt heavy, its contents a mystery that could either save or destroy them. Mia sat in the passenger seat, clutching the blue case tightly. The discovery had left her reeling, a mixture of relief and fear swirling in her chest. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, each word a reminder of the danger they faced. "We need to know what's on that drive," Henry said from the back seat. "If Amelia went to this much trouble to hide it, it must be important." "We'll find out soon enough," Elias replied. "But first, we need to ensure it's secure." They reached the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds. Elias instructed the security team to double their patrols, his voice firm and commanding. "No one gets in or out without my permission," he said. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension as they gathered in the study. Elias connected the USB drive to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "This could take a while," he said. "Mia, why don't you get some rest?" Mia shook her head. "I'm staying." Elias sighed, but didn't argue. As the files began to load, a knock at the door startled them. One of the security guards entered, his expression grim. "Sir, there's someone at the gate," he said. "They're asking for Mia." Elias's blood ran cold. "Who is it?" The guard hesitated. "Arthur Greaves." The room fell into an eerie silence, the weight of the guard's announcement pressing down on everyone. Mia's breath hitched as her fingers gripped the edges of the blue case tighter. Elias turned toward the guard, his expression hard and unreadable. "Lock the gate," Elias ordered firmly. "No one gets in." The guard nodded and left, but Mia could feel the rising panic in her chest. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How did he find us?" Elias moved to the window, his sharp gaze scanning the estate, grounds illuminated by the faint glow of the outdoor lights. "It doesn't matter how," he said, his voice cold. "What matters is that he won't get past the gate." Henry, standing near the study door, looked less certain. "Elias, if Greaves is here, it means he's desperate. Desperation makes men dangerous." Elias didn't turn from the window. "Let him be desperate," he said quietly. "He'll find out soon enough that he's made a mistake." Mia's fear bubbled to the surface. "You don't know him like I do," she said, her voice rising. "He doesn't care about rules or security. He'll find a way in." Elias finally turned to face her, his gaze steady but filled with determination. "Then let him try," he said. "But I promised you I'd protect you, Mia, and I keep my promises." Outside, Arthur Greaves paced in front of the locked gate, his scarred face twisted into a smirk. His two accomplices leaned against their vehicle, their casual postures at odds with the tension in the air. "This place is locked down tighter than a bank vault," one of the men muttered. Greaves shrugged, his eyes never leaving the distant mansion. Locks can be broken, he said. Guards can be distracted. And Moretti, he has no idea who he's dealing with. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket and dialed a number. When the call connected, his tone turned cold and commanding. "You know what to do," he said before ending the call. He turned to his men, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Let's give them something to worry about." Back in the mansion, Elias was strategizing with Henry in the study while Mia lingered near the doorway, her anxiety growing with each passing second. The tension in the air was palpable, each creak of the old house making her jump. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before the emergency generator kicked in. Henry cursed under his breath. That's not a coincidence. Elias didn't hesitate. "Mia, stay here," he ordered. He grabbed a flashlight from the desk and headed toward the security room with Henry close behind. In the security room, the screens showed the estate grounds bathed in the glow of floodlights, but something felt off. One of the guards was frantically speaking into a radio, his voice crackling through the speakers. "Sir, we've got movement near the east fence," the guard reported. "It looks like they're trying to cut through." Elias's jaw tightened. "Send a team to intercept them," he said, "and increase patrols on the west side. They might try a diversion." Henry glanced at him, his expression grim. "Elias, we need to consider the possibility that they'll get in." "They won't," Elias replied sharply. But even as he spoke the words, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. In the mansion, Mia paced the study, her heart pounding. The blue case sat on the desk, its contents still a mystery to her. She had been so consumed by the immediate danger that she hadn't had time to examine the notebook or the USB drive in detail. Now, with Elias and Henry occupied, she reached for the case, her hands trembling. Flipping open the notebook, she scanned the pages, her mother's handwriting filling every line. Financial records, names, dates. It was all there. But one page stood out. At the bottom of a list of names, her mother had written a single line: "Trust no one, not even the ones who claim to love you." Mia's stomach turned. What had her mother been so afraid of? And what did it mean for her now? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, a creak in the hallway outside the study. She froze, her ears straining to pick up the sound. Another creak. Someone was outside the door. Before she could react, the door burst open, and one of Greaves's men stormed in. Mia let out a startled cry, scrambling backward as the man advanced. "Found you," he said with a sneer, reaching for her. Mia grabbed the blue case and bolted for the door, narrowly slipping past him. Her adrenaline surged as she sprinted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Elias and Henry were already on their way back when they heard her scream. Elias's blood ran cold as he saw her racing toward them, the blue case clutched tightly in her arms. "They're inside," Mia shouted, panic in her voice. Elias didn't hesitate. "Get to the safe room," he ordered, pulling her behind him. He turned to Henry. "Take her. I'll handle this." Henry grabbed Mia's arm, guiding her toward the hidden door that led to the reinforced safe room. Mia protested, tears streaming down her face. "You can't do this alone." "I can, and I will," Elias said firmly. He turned and headed toward the sound of footsteps, his determination unwavering. Elias moved through the darkened corridors with calculated precision, his flashlight casting sharp beams of light that cut through the shadows. He could hear the intruders moving through the mansion, their heavy boots thudding against the floors. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He had spent years building this house into a fortress, and now it would prove its worth. In the grand hall, he spotted two of the men rummaging through the cabinets, their frustration evident as they overturned furniture and searched for something they couldn't find. "Looking for this." Elias's voice rang out, calm but deadly. The men turned, their eyes narrowing as they spotted him. One of them lunged forward, but Elias was faster. He sidestepped the attack and delivered a sharp blow to the man's ribs, sending him sprawling. The second man hesitated, clearly reassessing his opponent. Elias took the opportunity to grab a heavy candlestick from a nearby table, wielding it like a weapon. "Leave now, and I might let you walk out of here," he said, his voice cold. The man sneered but didn't move. Before he could attack, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The intruders exchanged a panicked glance before retreating, their footsteps echoing as they fled. Elias watched them go, his chest heaving with exertion. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had won a small victory. The mansion was quiet again, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't the calm, serene quiet of solitude that Elias had once cherished. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a storm that had passed but promised to return. The faint sound of rain tapping against the windows only deepened the weight in the air. Mia sat curled up on the sofa in the study, clutching the blue case tightly against her chest. Her hands trembled, her knuckles white, as she clung to the only thing left of her mother's secrets. Elias stood nearby, staring out of the window, his silhouette framed against the faint glow of the outdoor floodlights. Henry entered the room, his expression grim. "The police have taken the men into custody," he said, his voice low. But Greaves wasn't among them. Elias turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Henry sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't there when they arrived. He must have slipped away before the sirens got close. A curse escaped Elias's lips, his jaw tightening. He had suspected Greaves wouldn't go down so easily, but the confirmation that he was still out there sent a fresh wave of tension through him. "We'll need to increase security," he said. "And I want someone watching the property 24 hours a day." Henry nodded. "Already arranged. But you know as well as I do that Greaves won't stop. Not until he gets what he's after." Elias's gaze shifted to Mia, who was staring blankly at the floor. The events of the night had taken their toll on her. She looked small and fragile, a stark contrast to the fiery determination she had shown earlier. But even now, he could see the strength in her eyes, the same strength her mother had once had. "Mia," he said softly, crossing the room to sit beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." Elias studied her for a moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be fine," he said. "Not after everything you've been through." Mia's lip quivered, and she looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "I thought I was ready for this," she said. "But I'm not. I'm so scared." Elias's heart ached at her words. He had spent so much of his life building walls to keep the world out, but now, for the first time in years, he felt those walls begin to crack. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "We'll face this together. I promise you, Mia. I won't let anyone hurt you." As the night wore on, Elias and Henry reviewed the contents of the USB drive. The files were extensive, filled with encrypted documents, financial transactions, and names of individuals tied to illegal activities. The deeper they delved, the clearer it became that Amelia had stumbled upon something far larger than they had imagined. She was tracking these people for years, Henry said, scrolling through the files. And it looks like she found proof of their involvement in money laundering, embezzlement, and even human trafficking. Elias's hands clenched into fists. "And Greaves is part of this." Henry nodded. "He's one of their enforcers. But the real power lies with the people at the top, the ones Amelia was trying to expose." Elias leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The stakes had been high before, but now they felt insurmountable. Protecting Mia was no longer just about keeping her safe from Greaves. It was about dismantling the entire network that had taken so much from her family. "We'll need to take this to the authorities," Elias said. "But not yet. Not until we're sure Mia is safe." Henry hesitated. "You know that might not be enough. These people, they're not just going to roll over because we have evidence. They'll fight back." Elias's gaze hardened. "Then we'll fight harder." The next morning, the mansion was alive with activity. The security team had doubled their presence, patrolling the grounds with military precision. Inside, Elias was on the phone with his lawyer, arranging the next steps to ensure Mia's safety. I want full custody, Elias said, his tone firm. Whatever it takes, I want her protected under my name. His lawyer's voice crackled through the speakerphone. It won't be easy. Her foster father technically still has legal rights. Greaves lost his rights the moment he put her life in danger, Elias snapped. Find a way to make it happen. I don't care how much it costs. Mia stood in the doorway, listening quietly. She hadn't been sure how she felt about Elias taking custody of her. The idea of belonging to anyone, even someone as protective as Elias, felt foreign after so many years of fending for herself. But as she watched him fight for her, something inside her began to shift. When Elias ended the call, he turned to her. It's going to take some time, he said, but I'll make sure you're safe. Mia nodded, her voice soft. Thank you. Elias hesitated, then approached her, his expression serious. Mia, I need you to understand something, he said. This isn't just about keeping you safe. It's about giving you a chance at a better life. A life your mother would have wanted for you. Mia swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. I don't know how to live like this. You'll learn, Elias said gently. And you won't have to do it alone. As the day progressed, Elias and Mia began to settle into a tentative routine. He showed her around the mansion, revealing rooms that had long been locked away. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, Mia found an old easel and a collection of paints. Her mother's art supplies, untouched since the day Amelia had left. She used to spend hours in here, Elias said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. This was her sanctuary. Mia ran her fingers over the dried paint on the easel, imagining her mother standing there, lost in her art. She must have been amazing, she said softly. She was, Elias replied. And so are you. Mia turned to him, surprised by the words. For so long, she had felt invisible, like a shadow of her mother's memory. But in Elias's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in years, hope. The days after Greaves's intrusion passed in a haze of cautious routine and constant vigilance. The Moretti mansion, once a silent fortress of isolation, had transformed into a hub of activity. Security teams patrolled the grounds around the clock, contractors arrived to reinforce the gates, and Elias spent hours on calls with lawyers, investigators, and law enforcement. Yet amidst the chaos, a sense of warmth began to seep into the mansion's walls, something it hadn't known in years. Mia found herself drawn to the spaces that once belonged to her mother. With Elias's blessing, she began cleaning out Amelia's old studio, a room tucked away on the second floor, its large windows overlooking the estate gardens. Dust-covered canvases leaned against the walls, their vibrant colors dulled by time, and jars of dried paint were scattered across the work table. She spent hours in the studio, rediscovering the life her mother had left behind. One afternoon, as she sorted through a stack of sketches, she came across a small, unfinished painting. It depicted a young girl standing under a tree, her features delicate but unmistakable. Mia's breath caught as she realized the girl in the painting was her. Her mother had painted her from memory, the brushstrokes capturing a love that Mia could feel even now. Elias found her there later that evening, sitting on the floor with the painting in her lap. He stepped into the room quietly, his gaze sweeping over the space that had once been Amelia's sanctuary. "You've done a good job with this room," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Mia looked up, startled. "I just wanted to bring it back to life," she said. "It felt wrong to leave it like it was." Elias nodded, his eyes lingering on the painting in her hands. "She would have loved that," he said. "This room was where she felt most alive. Seeing you here, it's like having a piece of her back." Mia hesitated, then held up the painting. "She painted this of me," she said. "Did you know about it?" Elias shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No," he admitted, "but I'm not surprised. She was always finding ways to keep you close, even when you weren't with her." Mia studied his face, the lines of grief and guilt etched deep into his features. "She loved you," she said quietly. even when she stayed away. I know she loved you. Elias's throat tightened, and he looked away. I failed her, he said. I failed both of you. No, Mia said firmly, her voice stronger than she expected. You're here now. That's what matters. For a moment, Elias didn't respond. Then he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Mia, he said, his voice rough with emotion. That means more than you know. Over the next few days, Elias and Mia began restoring other parts of the mansion together. The East Wing, long abandoned, became their project. They uncovered furniture hidden beneath dust-covered sheets, polished the ornate woodwork, and opened the shutters to let in the sunlight that had been absent for so many years. With each room they restored, the mansion seemed to come alive, its somber atmosphere giving way to something lighter and warmer. For Mia, it was a way to connect with her mother's past. For Elias, it was a way to honor the family he had lost and the one he had found again. On a crisp autumn morning, the Moretti mansion stood transformed. The once dim corridors were filled with light, the rooms restored to their former glory. The gardens, meticulously tended, were vibrant with blooms of red, yellow, and orange. And within its walls, a new sense of life had taken root. Mia stood by the window in the dining room, gazing out at the grounds where the security team conducted their patrols. It was a far cry from the life she had known before, a life of fear, constant running, and isolation. Now, for the first time in years, she felt something she had thought was lost forever: safety. Elias entered the room, carrying a stack of papers. He set them down on the table and gestured for Mia to join him. These are the final custody documents, he said, his tone serious but tinged with relief. Once you sign, everything will be official. Mia hesitated, her fingers brushing over the edge of the papers. She looked up at Elias, her eyes searching his face. Are you sure about this? She asked. Taking me in, it's a big responsibility. Elias's expression softened. Mia, there's nothing I'm more certain about, he said. Your family. And family takes care of each other. Mia nodded slowly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She picked up the pen and signed her name, the act feeling both momentous and surreal. When she set the pen down, Elias reached across the table and placed a hand over hers. This is just the beginning, he said. We'll figure everything out together. Later that evening, Mia and Elias stood in the library, surrounded by the books and memories that had become their shared sanctuary. The blue case sat on the desk, its contents now fully examined and cataloged. The evidence Amelia had gathered was enough to bring down the network that had threatened their lives, but it would take time and careful planning. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Mia turned to Elias. What happens now? She asked. Elias smiled faintly. Now we move forward, he said. We use what your mother left behind to make sure no one else has to suffer the way she did. And we build a future worth fighting for. Mia nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. She glanced at the painting her mother had done of her, now framed and hanging above the fireplace. She'd be proud of us, wouldn't she? She would, Elias said without hesitation. And she'd want you to know how much she loved you. Mia smiled, the weight of the past lifting just slightly. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. And as she stood beside Elias, she knew that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Thank you for watching. Hey there, amazing viewers. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It helps us keep bringing you more exciting stories. We'd love to hear from you. What part of the story had the most impact on you? Was it the emotional connection between Mia and Elias, the secrets revealed, or the suspense of Greaves's pursuit? Let us know in the comments below. Also, we're always looking to create stories you'll love, so drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments. Whether it's thrilling mysteries, heartfelt family dramas, or tales of redemption, we want to hear what you want to see next. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next story.